This is a big tale, and it concerns one Mr. James Fritzer. Now, Mr. Fritzer was a rather elderly man, about 90 years old, and he spent most of his time tinkering away with his model people and his model buildings and his model trains. He liked to imagine that when he wasn't looking, these model people had their own lives. They went about their own daily routine. And he also had a passion for adventure stories. He liked stories about mountain climbing and jungle exploration. And in his younger days, he'd often thought he'd go off on great adventures like this. But at the same time, he didn't really have any regrets. He had loved his life, having his wife marry and his 3 wonderful sons, and he wouldn't have traded that for anything in the world. Still, he did feel rather unimportant. He had never really done anything of great value. So he decided to become a bus driver. And every morning he'd get up at about 5 o'clock and he'd put on his baseball cap and his blue jacket and he'd drive the children to school. He hoped to inspire them, to make them go off and become great men and women someday. And the children all loved Mr. Fritzer, especially his habit of making phrases like good gravy and jumping gumballs. Well, one Wednesday, he was done driving the children from school, and he decided to go down to the Hogshead and have a beer. And it was his habit to take a walk through the forest, because the bar wasn't too far from his house, and he enjoyed the exercise. And one day he was walking down the trail, when he noticed that some dark clouds were beginning to form in the sky, and he realized that it was going to rain, so he began to quicken his pace. Soon he came across 2 paths that diverged in the forest. And as he walked over to it, he thought to himself that he had never seen that other path before. But then he thought that maybe this was a path he went when he was a little child, and he could get to the bar 5 minutes early. So he headed down this path, not realizing that this memory was fabricated in his own imagination, and that path had never been there before until that day. As he walked, he noticed that the clouds began to part from the skies, and it seemed to get hot, almost like a summer day. And he also noticed that the trees seemed to be much larger here, and the air seemed fresher. And he assumed that this was just some weird part of the forest. And he soon began to realize, though, that he was in fact lost. He'd been wandering around for hours. So he began to look around, trying to find a house or somebody to call, or some river, or some kind of landscape to be able to get back home. And as he walked, he came across something very curious. As he turned the corner of one tree, he saw a huge shoe out in the middle of the forest, just there, completely out of place. As he walked up, he thought to himself, "Well, I feel rather muddled. What is a giant shoe doing out here? This thing's as big as a van." And as he thought about it, he said, "Well, maybe this is one of them college kids' pranks or something." And he walked away, thinking to himself that when he found a house and called his wife and told her how he got lost in the forest, how funny it would be to tell her about this giant shoe that he had found. But then he saw another strange thing, which began to put some doubt into his mind. As he walked over, he saw this giant bird, fly out of a tree. And as he looked up, he said to himself, "Well, that almost looked like the pterodactyl," he said. But then he laughed and said that it must have just been a really big eagle. But then he came out into this expanse of desert, and he realized he was truly very lost, for he had never seen anywhere in Horsefeather like this big desert with all these rocks out everywhere you look. So he walked for a little while in the desert, and it was rather hot, so he decided to take a stop and rest. And so he sat down and he pulled out a peanut butter sandwich from his trouser pocket, and he nibbled out a bit of the corner. And as he sat there eating, he looked over and he noticed that one of the stones almost looked like a human face. Why, that's where the bonker would be, the nose, and that's where the blinkers would be, thought Mr. Fritzer to himself. And rather jokingly, he picked up a stick and threw it at the stone. Well, the moment the stick hit the stone, suddenly the stone's eyes popped open, and it stood up to reveal itself to be as large as a large boulder. And the creature said, "Who disturbs my rest? I am Ragnar." And he looked down. "And what are you, pray?" And Mr. Fritzer began to shake rather nervously, and he would have made a run for it then and there, but he realized that if he tried, the giant would have just snatched him up and eaten him whole. And Mr. Fritzer said, I am a grasshopper," said Mr. Fritzer. "A grasshopper, you say?" said Ragnar. Well, what are you doing in my terrain? Have you ever been here before?" "No," said Mr. Fritzer. I was lost. I was just trying to find my way back home. I must have gone down one of the wrong paths. I truly apologize." And the giant said, Well, you should not be here, and the penalty for trespassing in my terrain is death." "Well," said Mr. Fritzer, "you can't blame me. I didn't know." "So," said the giant, "you say you are a grasshopper, huh? Well, I am known to dissect little creatures like yourself and study them. I have a whole shed where I experiment with animals, putting their parts together, stitching them up into monstrosities. And I think you would be the perfect specimen for one of my new experiments, yes." Mr. Fritzer, he realized that this giant was truly insane, for there was a sort of mad spark in his eyes. And Mr. Fritzer said, "Oh, but you wouldn't want to do that." "And why not?" said the giant. "Why, because my wife knows that I'm gone, and if she finds out that you harmed even a hair on my head, well, she'll send the police, and they'll come in their little metal birdies, and they'll drop down eggs on you that'll explode, that could destroy entire countrysides," said Mr. Fritzer. The giant chuckled to himself. "Ha! I do not believe a single word that you say. You'd do anything to keep your life, wouldn't you, little creature? Besides, 1,000 little creatures like you could not possibly destroy a mighty beast like myself. Why, I am the king of the giants. In my time I slayed thousands of giants, and I am the one that created all of these terrains. I made the mountains, the rivers, the lakes. I was the one who put the clouds up in the sky." Well, Mr. Fritzer was still shaking rather nervously, and the giant said, "Come. You will come back to my home, and if you do good service for me, I might make you live. However, if you do not, I will have to perform my experiments on you." Then the giant snatched Mr. Fritzer up, and he took him back to his house. Anyways, from that point on, Mr. Fritzer began to do work for the giant. But of course he was rather small, and the work the giant was giving him was a little too big for him. The first task the giant gave him was to go get his slippers. But as Mr. Fritzer walked to grab hold of the slippers and take them out, a cat came. The cat looked at him with his yellow eyes and began to chase Mr. Fritzer all around the room. And Mr. Fritzer was just barely able to run into a mouse hole, and the cat sat there waiting for quite a few hours before Mr. Fritzer hatched a scheme. He let out a loud grunt like Ragnar would. "Cat," he said, "get out of here, scram!" And the cat, thinking that its master was about to kick it in the rear, made a run for it. And Mr. Fritzer was able to make his retreat, and he told the giant everything, and the giant said, "My cat will keep an eye on you, old Green's Eyes," he said, "and if you try to make an escape, he will eat you up. But I will give you a much simpler task now. Go out into my orchard and pick some apples for my apple pie I am baking tonight." So Mr. Fritzer did as he was told. He went out into the orchard, and he came across a tree with some apples, but the tree was much too strong and powerful for him to shake and get the apples down. So he picked up a rock and he threw it at the apple. And the apple managed to fall down, but the apple was so big that Mr. Fritzer had trouble pushing it down the hill. And it took him quite a few hours before he was finally able to get it to the giant's home. The giant looked down at the apple and said, "1 apple? That's not enough for a pie. Well, I will give you another task. You shall make me some soup," said the giant. Well, Mr. Fritzer actually had a little bit of a better time making the soup for the giant, and he was actually very successful at this for a couple of weeks. But then one week he was stirring the soup when he accidentally fell down, and he landed in one of the pieces of celery, and he began to scream and cry, and the giant finally heard him and picked him out and said, "You have contaminated my soup. It's uneatable now. Well, you have proven that you are not any worth to me at all, as you are not worth anything to anyone." For Mr. Fritzer at this point had told him all about his job as a bus driver and his world itself, and how he wasn't really actually a grasshopper. Anyways, the giant took him to his shed, and Mr. Fritzer saw hanging on the walls all sorts of dead animals, squirrels with their intestines ripped out, and lizards with their tongues pulled out and put on their heads, just weird sort of stuff. And anyways, because the giant was into that artistic kind of animal mutation stuff. Well, anyways, the giant put Mr. Fritzer down on stone, and he tied down his arms and his legs, and he said, "And now I should dissect you. And I would like you to know that your family hasn't come for you, have they? The police have not arrived. You are just as small and insignificant as I thought you were. And what am I? A powerful giant like myself. Why, I am the strongest and greatest creature in this universe. None living creature could defy me." And the giant pulled out his knife, and Mr. Fritzer said, "Well, maybe you're right. Maybe I am rather unimportant. But you should know something. Giant, That just because I might be unimportant, why, little small creatures like myself are what made big creatures like yourself what they are. And sometimes in life it's the most seemingly unimportant things in this world that are actually the most important things at all. And I'm very proud to be a bus driver, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. And anyways, the giant looked down at him and said, well, enough of this talk. I'll be silencing you, and soon enough you won't even have a tongue. And the giant, he lifted up his knife to cut apart Mr. Fritzer, when suddenly there was a loud thump, and the giant began to shake, and then there was another loud thump. Mr. Fritzer looked around, wondering what in the world could be making that noise, and the giant seemed terrified, and he put down the knife. "Oh, no," he said. And then, all at once, there was the loudest thump of all, and Mr. Fritzer looked over to see a bunch of giants approaching. And these giants were even larger than Ragnar, as large as trees, and they had red beards and long red hair, and they walked up and they crowded around Ragnar and began hitting him on the side of the head. And Ragnar began to look down, and he was rather cast, and he even seemed a little sinister to Mr. Fritzer. "There you are," said Mortimer. "What are you doing, harming a little creature like this? Don't you know that we giants never cause unnecessary pain to a creature?" I know," said Ragnar. "You do not follow the laws of my land. Why, if you were not my brother, I would have you executed." And Mortimer, he looked down at Mr. Fritzer and freed him and said, "I'm sorry for my brother's actions. He was always a rather mischievous one." And Mr. Fritzer watched as the giant had his ears boxed, and he realized that Ragnar was actually just the runt of the pack, and even felt a little bit sorry for him. But Mortimer seemed like a rather pleasant giant, and he put Mr. Fritzer in his pocket, and he said, "Come, you shall know the generosity of the giants. We shall take you back to the tribe, and we shall have a feast for you." And the giant did as he promised. He took Mr. Fritzer out into the desert, and that night, under the stars, which seemed so beautiful out in the sky, clear and without any clouds or congestion, as in the city they would be, the giant had a feast for Mr. Fritzer, and Mr. Fritzer enjoyed dancing and acrobats and fire-eaters, and he enjoyed a meal that could have fed him for months, actually. 1 pea, in fact, would have been enough to survive off for a year, probably. As Mr. Fritzer sat there, the giant told him stories about how the humans and giants were of the same tribe, and that one day, at the end of the world, the giants would come upon the kingdoms of man and destroy them, and that giants would take over the world. And Mortimer, he said, "But not all giants are evil, Mr. Fritzer. Some of us are good and some of us are bad, just like some humans are good and some humans are bad." And Mr. Fritzer asked, Do you have any idea, Mortimer, my lord, how it was that I came into this land?" And Mortimer shook his head. "I don't know for certain, but I think it's one of those moments in the universe where things just stop making sense just because they could, almost as if the universe is just having a little fun for a change, and you were the victim of this particular case. However, perhaps there is a chance that you could get back. You should walk down the trail in your forest and see whether that will work, whether you will be able to get back home." And anyways, the giant soon led Mr. Fritzer down through the forest the very next morning. And as they came to the trail, the giant said, "Well, this is where I leave you, and if you need to come back, I will be waiting for you." And Mr. Fritzer thanked him, and the giant said, "And I want you to remember, Mr. Fritzer, that there is always creatures that are bigger and more powerful than you. Even we giants are known to bow down to those that are stronger and that come from higher regions, be they angels, genies, or God himself. Now, Mr. Fritzer, go back home, and go back to your family." "Yes," said Mr. Fritzer, "because I always feel rather important with them." Mr. Fritzer bid the giant good day, and he walked back home. And soon enough he was back with his wife and his 3 sons, and he told them all the story, and they couldn't even believe it. He'd been gone for months, and the story just seemed so incredible. But soon enough the newspaper picked it up, and all the people of Horsefeather picked it up, and there are many people in Horsefeather to this day that believe Mr. Fritzer is mad. But we here at the Fireside Tales have looked into the case and find that there is pieces of information Mr. Fritzer couldn't possibly have known unless he was in fact visited by the Fireside Tales. And so I leave you off with this thought, that size is rather relative in this universe. And as always, sweet dreams and good night.